city. The world seemed indifferent to her suffering, but somehow she kept her spirits intact. Despite everything, she clung to the idea that things could change, that there was a better life waiting for her somewhere beyond the filthy streets. One chilly evening, as Mara walked past the Sterling, the city's most renowned restaurant, her stomach growled loudly, a sharp reminder of the emptiness she'd come to accept. The Sterling gleamed like a jewel in the darkness, a beacon of wealth and refinement. It was a place where the city's elite gathered, celebrating their fortunes over lavish meals and fine wine. She had never stepped inside, never had the chance to taste the luxury within, but she often watched it from afar. Today, as she passed by, something felt different. She caught sight of a woman in an elegant fur coat entering the restaurant. Her name was Celeste Waverley, the wife of the influential businessman Alden Waverley. Celeste was the picture of sophistication and grace, a woman whose every move seemed choreographed by the society she belonged to. Mara had seen her many times before, always by her husband's side, always walking with an air of superiority. They were admired, revered even, for their wealth and power. Yet to Mara, they seemed like figures from another world, a world she could never touch. Curiosity tugged at Mara as she peered through the fogged kitchen window. She squinted, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding inside. There, amidst the bustle of chefs preparing plates for the elite patrons, she saw Celeste again. But this time, something was different. In her hand, Celeste held a small vial of dark liquid, a substance that seemed out of place in the polished world of fine dining. With the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, Celeste poured the liquid onto a dish being prepared for Alden. Mara's heart raced as she watched. Her instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. As the final touches were placed on the meal, Celeste quickly left the kitchen, her mission seemingly complete. A chill ran down Mara's spine. She didn't know what the liquid was, but she knew enough to understand that it wasn't meant to be a harmless ingredient. Something about it felt wrong, and an uneasy feeling settled in her gut. Panic surged within her. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand by and watch. But as she moved toward the entrance of the restaurant, the security guard stepped in her way, blocking her path. His eyes narrowed as he took in her disheveled appearance, a girl from the streets trying to enter a world she didn't belong in. Mara's breath hitched, but her desperation fueled her. She couldn't let Alden eat the food. It wasn't just a meal, it was a weapon. She tried to push past the guard, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Don't eat that! Your wife put poison in it!" she shouted, hoping against hope that someone would hear her. But the guard didn't budge. His expression remained unchanged, dismissive. Inside, Alden Waverley, completely unaware of the danger, sat at his table preparing to enjoy his meal. His well-groomed face was calm, as always, and his sharp eyes seemed to survey the room with the confidence of a man who had everything in life. Mara's hands trembled as she pounded on the door. "Please! You don't understand! She's poisoning him!" she cried out, but her words fell on deaf ears. She could see the plated dish being set down in front of Alden, the gleaming surface of the food reflecting the ambient light of the luxurious restaurant. Alden picked up his fork, unaware of the danger. Mara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him take a bite. Her mind raced, but it felt like time had slowed. The world outside the restaurant seemed to fade, and the only thing she could focus on was the plate of food in Alden's hands. Then the unthinkable happened. Alden's face suddenly went pale, and he convulsed, clutching his throat as he fell backward in his chair. The scene erupted in chaos. Screams filled the air, and waitstaff rushed to his side. Mara's legs moved before her mind could catch up, and she was sprinting toward him, hoping to stop the disaster, to somehow save him. But before she could reach him, the restaurant staff had already descended upon her. They grabbed her roughly, accusing her of causing the commotion. She tried to explain, tried to shout out the truth, but no one was listening. In an instant, the police arrived, and she was arrested on the spot. As they pulled her away from the scene, Mara's cries for help were drowned out by the crowd's hysteria. No one cared about the street girl who had tried to warn them. No one cared about her truth. They only cared about the spectacle, about Alden's collapse, and about silencing the girl who dared to speak out. The cold, sterile walls of the holding cell offered no comfort. Mara sat on the hard bench, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the grey concrete floor. The clang of the cell door closing behind her still echoed in her ears, and the murmurs of the other inmates seemed to blur into the background. She had never felt so small, so powerless. She had tried to save him, tried to warn them all, but now here she was, accused of a crime she hadn't committed. No one cared about her story. No one cared about the truth. She was just another street girl, easily dismissed, her words meaningless. Hours passed, maybe even days. Time had become irrelevant in the cold confines of the cell. She had no visitors, no one to fight for her. The police had made it clear that they didn't believe her, and the evidence stacked against her seemed insurmountable. The security footage from the restaurant had caught her running toward the scene, but it also showed her shouting, flailing her arms as if she were the one causing the chaos. The staff had testified that she'd been disruptive, and despite her frantic pleas, they had painted her as nothing more than a nuisance, a street urchin who had gotten caught up in a situation far beyond her understanding. And then there was Celeste. Mara had seen her face before. Calm, collected, her cold eyes locked onto Mara as the girl was dragged from the restaurant. Celeste had been the picture of concern, pretending to be the loving wife, her hands clasped in a show of innocence as she played the grieving spouse. The police had immediately gravitated toward her, latching onto her version of events. A poor, unstable girl had somehow gotten it into her head to attack Alden, to poison him, to ruin their perfect life. But Mara knew the truth. She had seen the vial, had seen Celeste pour it onto the plate with a calculated hand. Celeste was no innocent woman. She was a cold-hearted killer, willing to sacrifice her husband for money and power. But no one would believe Mara. Who would listen to the homeless girl over the wealthy, poised socialite? The system had already decided who the victim was, and it wasn't her. The sound of footsteps approaching the cell door broke her from her thoughts. She didn't bother looking up, knowing it was just another guard passing by, checking on the prisoners. But the footsteps stopped right outside her cell, and there was a pause before the door opened. Mara lifted her head, her heart sinking in her chest when she saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was Alden. He looked different from the man she had seen in the restaurant, pale, weary, but very much alive. His suit was rumpled, his hair unkempt, and there was a certain vulnerability in his eyes that made him appear less like the commanding businessman and more like a man who had just survived a near-death experience. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was still an air of authority about him, and the sight of him standing there in front of her cell left Mara speechless. He stepped into the cell, his gaze focused on her with an intensity that made Mara uneasy. The guard who had followed him lingered in the hallway, watching silently. Alden closed the door behind him, and for a moment there was only silence. "I know you're innocent," Alden finally spoke, his voice low and steady, the words almost a whisper. "But I need you to tell me everything. What happened that night?" Mara blinked, her mouth dry. She hadn't expected this. She had expected to be ignored, to be left to rot in the cell. But here he was, standing before her, offering her a chance to explain. Her mind raced, but the words caught in her throat. I saw her," Mara stammered, her voice shaking. "I saw her put something in your food. A vial. I tried to warn you, but they didn't listen. They thought I was crazy." Alden's eyes softened for a moment and he sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. I remember you shouting. I didn't know what was happening, but I remember your voice, your panic. And then, nothing. It's all a blur after that. Mara felt a strange knot in her chest. For a moment, she dared to hope. Maybe this man, this stranger, was going to listen. Maybe he could help her. Alden, I swear to you I wasn't trying to hurt you, she pleaded, her voice desperate. I was trying to save you, your wife. She was poisoning you. She's behind all of this. Alden's expression hardened. Celeste. His voice trailed off, and for the first time, Mara saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I've known her for years. She's been by my side through everything. But I know something's not right. I've been blind, trusting her without seeing who she really is. Mara felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was just a man caught in a web of lies and betrayal. She had seen his face when he collapsed, helpless, vulnerable, and in pain. No one deserved that. But he was beginning to see what she had witnessed all along. Let me help you, Mara said, her voice quiet but firm. You need to expose her. She's dangerous. Alden's gaze remained locked on hers for a long moment. I'll need proof. If we're going to get her, we need evidence. Something concrete that no one can deny. Mara nodded, her mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. Celeste was a master manipulator, a woman who had carefully crafted her image and controlled everything around her. But together, Mara and Alden might stand a chance. Alden straightened, his eyes steely with resolve. You're free to go. I'll make sure they release you, but we need to move quickly. I'm going to find the truth, and I won't stop until I get it. We'll bring her down together. The days that followed felt like a blur for Mara. After Alden's visit to the cell, everything changed. She was released, much to her disbelief. The authorities were still skeptical, but Alden had used his influence to secure her freedom. He had ensured that she was not only released from her cell, but also given a place to stay, a small apartment, a far cry from the cold alleyways she had grown accustomed to. It was the first time in her life that she'd felt safe, even for just a moment. Despite the luxury of the new apartment, Mara found it hard to relax. Every creak of the building, every strange sound in the night, reminded her of the streets, the unpredictable, unforgiving world she had left behind. But she knew that this was not just a chance for her to escape her past. It was a chance to make a difference, to help Alden bring justice to a woman who had caused so much pain. Mara was beginning to realize just how deeply Celeste's poison ran through the veins of their lives. It wasn't just about the poisoning. It was about the web of lies, manipulation, and deceit that Celeste had spun over the years. The more Alden spoke to her about his wife, the more he uncovered about Celeste's cunning nature. She had always been perfect on the outside, the image of grace, charm, and class, but beneath that exterior, she was a woman driven by greed and power. Alden had started investigating her quietly, using his resources to dig deeper into her activities. At first, it had been small things, unusual transactions in their joint accounts, whispers from employees who had been too scared to speak out. But as he dug further, the evidence mounted. Celeste had been siphoning money from their businesses into hidden accounts, using her position as a trusted wife to conceal her actions. It wasn't just financial fraud. There were rumors of people who had been silenced by her charm, and those who had crossed her had mysteriously disappeared or been ruined. Alden had never seen it before. He had trusted Celeste completely, believing in her flawless facade. But now, everything seemed like a lie, a carefully constructed house of cards that was falling apart, piece by piece. Mara, Alden said one evening, his voice steady, but with a hint of the exhaustion he couldn't hide. I've found more. There's a pattern, a clear one. She's been plotting this for years. Mara had spent the past few days with Alden, helping him search through Celeste's documents, emails, and bank records. The evidence was undeniable. She had been planning to kill Alden, to take over his businesses, and leave nothing but ashes in her wake. The poisoning was only the tip of the iceberg. What Celeste had done was far worse than anyone could have imagined. "I need to confront her," Alden said, the resolve in his eyes hardening with each passing day. "She's already tried to kill me once. I won't let her do it again." Mara hesitated. The thought of confronting Celeste, of facing the woman who had manipulated and poisoned not only Alden but also the people around her, was daunting. Celeste was dangerous, not just with her words, but with her wealth, power, and influence. She had everything on her side, and Mara knew she would stop at nothing to protect her secrets. "You don't have to do it alone," Mara said softly, her eyes meeting Alden's. "I'll help you. I'm the one who saw her do it, after all. I'm the key to exposing her." Alden looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had never thought that a girl like Mara, someone so far removed from his world, could be the one to help him in his darkest hour. But it was true. Mara had risked her life to warn him. Without her, he would have been just another victim, his death written off as an unfortunate accident. "Thank you," Alden said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would do without you. You've given me hope again." They spent the next few days preparing, gathering more evidence to ensure that Celeste's crimes would be exposed for all to see. They knew the danger they were walking into, but they also knew that they had no other choice. The truth had to come out. If they didn't act now, Celeste would continue to operate with impunity, her wealth and power shielding her from the consequences of her actions. Mara felt a strange sense of purpose growing inside her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just fighting to survive, she was fighting for something bigger than herself. She had spent so long being invisible, but now, with Alden by her side, she had a chance to make a real difference. This was her moment to stand up for what was right, to use everything she had learned from her life on the streets to fight against the cruelty that Celeste embodied. But as they made their final preparations, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that Celeste was always one step ahead. She was watching them, waiting for the moment when they would slip up. It was clear that the final confrontation was inevitable, and when it came, it would be a battle of wills. They had everything they needed to bring Celeste down, but in the world they were playing in, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The night before they planned to confront Celeste, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay wide awake in the small apartment Alden had arranged for her, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the coming day pressing down on her chest. The quiet hum of the city outside did little to soothe her nerves. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap, that Celeste had already anticipated their every move. Mara's thoughts kept drifting back to the night at the restaurant. The way Celeste had looked at her, almost as if she knew exactly what Mara had seen. It had been a look of calculated indifference, but there was something else, something far more sinister. In the restaurant, Mara had thought she'd been doing the right thing. But now, looking back, she wondered if Celeste had always known that her schemes would eventually be uncovered. She sighed and pulled the blanket tighter around her, trying to push the fear aside. But it was impossible to ignore the reality they were about to face. Celeste had already killed once, and nothing would stop her from doing it again if she felt cornered. She was a woman of immense power, a woman who had manipulated everything in her life to suit her desires. Mara knew that confronting her would be dangerous, but there was no other choice. They had the evidence now. Alden would bring her down. They would expose everything. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, Mara stood up from the bed. She could hear Alden's muffled voice in the next room, speaking quietly on the phone, no doubt finalizing plans with the lawyers and investigators. He had been tirelessly working to gather more evidence, but the closer they got to the confrontation, the more it seemed like Celeste was moving faster, pulling strings to protect herself. Mara gathered her thoughts, steadying herself for what lay ahead. She had spent so long in the shadows, hiding from the world, hiding from the pain of her past. But now she was part of something bigger. She wasn't just a witness, she was part of the fight for justice. She had a purpose. And tomorrow, they would expose Celeste for who she really was. When Alden entered the room, he looked as composed as always, but his eyes betrayed the fatigue and stress that had begun to take its toll. There was a weariness to his posture, but also an unshakable resolve. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of determination. Mara nodded. "I'm ready. We've come this far. There's no turning back now." Alden placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of reassurance. "You've been incredible, Mara. I don't think I could have done this without you." Mara looked up at him, her throat tightening. She wasn't used to receiving praise, let alone from someone like Alden. She had always been the one who had to fend for herself, the one who had to survive on her own. But in this moment, with everything on the line, she realized that maybe she wasn't alone anymore. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she had someone who believed in her. "We'll do this together," she said quietly. The day passed in a blur of preparation. They met with the lawyers and gathered the final pieces of evidence. As the afternoon turned to evening, Alden received a call that made his eyes narrow with concern. His expression hardened and his jaw tightened as he listened to the voice on the other end. "I'll handle it," he said curtly before hanging up the phone. "It's time." Mara's heart skipped a beat as she followed him out of the apartment. They were heading straight into the lion's den. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself now, couldn't afford to let the fear take hold. If they were going to bring Celeste down, they had to act quickly. The drive to the Waverley mansion was eerily silent. Alden didn't speak, his eyes focused on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Mara could sense his nerves beneath the calm exterior. He was about to face the woman he had loved and trusted for so many years, the woman who had tried to take his life, who had manipulated him and countless others to secure her own power. When they arrived at the mansion, the grandeur of the place felt suffocating. The high walls, the gated entrance, the perfectly manicured lawns, all of it seemed like a symbol of the cold, calculating nature of the woman who lived inside. But as Alden walked toward the front door, there was no hesitation in his step. This wasn't just about exposing Celeste anymore. It was about reclaiming his life, reclaiming the truth. Mara followed closely behind him, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what would happen once they stepped inside. She didn't know if Celeste would try to deny everything, or if she would resort to more devious tactics. But one thing was certain. This would be the moment that defined everything. As Alden rang the doorbell, Mara glanced up at the house. She could see the faint outline of someone moving inside, the curtains twitching slightly as if someone was watching them. Celeste. She was ready. The door swung open, revealing Celeste standing in the doorway, her expression as perfect as ever. She was dressed in an elegant gown, her makeup flawless, her hair styled in soft waves that framed her face. She looked like the picture of grace and